A woman kneels in the dark. Her children are beside her, confused, perhaps frightened, but still clinging to hope. A harsh voice commands silence. Then, without ceremony, without justice, without even a final word, the gunfire begins. It does not end cleanly. The bullets bounce. The girls scream. The youngest child, Tatiana, curls into her mother's lap, only to be pulled away by bayonets. It is chaos, it is theatre, it is ritual, but above all, it is annihilation. This is not a royal execution, it is an extermination, and at its center was Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, once the glittering empress of all Russia, now reduced to a bullet-riddled corpse in a cellar. But what really happened to Alexandra Romanova in the days and hours leading up to that night? You've heard the sanitized version, the tragic empress, the loyal wife, the overbearing mystic, maybe even the foreign witch trope. But history has lied to you, or at the very least concealed the unbearable truth. The final months of Tsarina Alexandra's life were not just a slow walk toward death. They were a descent into psychological torture, social collapse, and intimate betrayal. Behind the elegance of imperial gowns and gilded palaces lay a woman dismantled by grief, illness, and the corrosive weight of power she could neither hold nor escape. This is the story of a woman hated by a nation and abandoned by a world that once begged for her touch. A woman who watched her children waste away in front of her, who heard the walls of her prison closing in long before the executioners arrived. To understand the horror of Alexandra's final fate, we must peel away the myth of the doomed Romanovs and look squarely into the cracked mirror of a crumbling empire. The year is 1917. Russia is choking on its own wounds. A war no one believes in, a monarchy no one trusts. Famine stalks the cities, revolution simmers in the streets, and in the eye of this hurricane sits Alexandra, German-born, deeply religious, and now regent in her husband's absence. Nicholas, her husband, is on the front lines playing soldier czar, leaving Alexandra to rule from Petrograd. But Alexandra is no Catherine the Great. Her confidence is brittle, her decisions erratic. Worse still, she has allowed the enigmatic Rasputin, a filthy mystic with a piercing gaze and unshakable influence, into the heart of her court. To the Russian people, Alexandra is no longer empress. She is the enemy within, the German spy, the puppet of a mad monk, the foreign queen who let the Russian throne rot from the inside out. Every whisper in court becomes a rumor of betrayal. Every military loss becomes her fault. Every moment of weakness is fed into the ravenous mouth of public fury. No longer an icon of beauty and grace, Alexandra becomes the embodiment of decay, and all the while her body betrays her too. The stress, the heart palpitations, the migraines, the unbearable worry for her hemophiliac son Alexei, who bleeds at the slightest bruise and whom only Rasputin seems able to calm. In her diary she prays, weeps, scribbles meaningless details, anything, to keep the darkness at bay. But it is already too late. By March 1917, the Romanov dynasty is no more. The revolution has won. Nicholas is forced to abdicate. Alexandra, stripped of power and status, becomes simply Alexandra Romanova. But the fall from empress to prisoner is not immediate. It is a slow, deliberate unmaking. At first, the Romanovs are kept under house arrest in the Alexander Palace. There are still meals, books, even brief walks in the garden. But the guards change. Their faces harden. The laughter of her children fades. Alexandra senses something coming, something final. In letters, she still refers to herself as Mama, still writes to Nicholas as my treasure. But the tone is different now, clipped, hollowed. There are long silences in the text, as if she is speaking from behind glass, and then comes the transfer. Siberia, from royalty to rats, from candlelit. Salons to frozen exile. The house where they are taken is called the House of Special Purpose, a name so clinical it bleeds menace. The windows are painted over, the walls are bugged. The guards now mock openly. The children are spat upon. And Alexandra begins to disappear inside herself. She prays more, talks less. Her once feared letters become quiet, erratic. Her daughters stop asking questions. Even little Alexei no longer plays with his toys. There is a collective silence among them, as if the family, once the embodiment of divine right, has become a ghost long before death. But death is coming, and it will not be clean, it will not be merciful, and it will be far more horrifying than the world has ever wanted to admit. The journey from divinity to degradation is rarely swift. For Tsarina Alexandra, it was excruciatingly slow, drawn out across endless corridors of despair, illness, paranoia, and betrayal. Her fall wasn't just political, it was deeply, intimately psychological. By the time she arrived at the House of Special Purpose in Ekaterinburg in the spring of 1918, Alexandra was already a shell of the woman who once dazzled the courts of Europe. Her body ached from a lifetime of stress and untreated illness. Her spirit was worn thin by grief, constant fear for her children, and the cruel irony of her faith. She had spent decades believing that suffering was purification. Now, suffering consumed everything. The Romanovs were no longer rulers, not even prisoners of status. They were inmates under siege, stripped of identity and humanity by the day. And Alexandra, once mistress of 1,000 servants, was now forced to clean floors, cook food, and answer to teenage guards who spat at her feet and called her German bitch. But worse than the cruelty was the silence. The world had stopped looking. Europe's monarchies, once so interconnected through blood and diplomacy, did nothing. England, where her cousin King George V reigned, turned its back on her, fearing a Republican backlash at home. Letters stopped coming. The press grew quieter, but there would be no rescue. Alexandra had become politically toxic, a living symbol of everything Russians had come to hate. Autocracy, German influence, religious fanaticism, privilege, blindness. Her past, her face, even her accent were enough to condemn her. Still, she tried to maintain some sense of structure. In the house, she imposed schedules, encouraged reading, and insisted on religious observance. It was less about hope than ritual, something to hold on to while reality unraveled, but the walls were closing in, literally and metaphorically. Their windows were boarded, their rooms bugged, the children were allowed less and less daylight. The guards would enter at will, sometimes rummaging through personal effects, sometimes whispering threats, just loud enough to be heard. At night, the Tsarina wrote in her diary, her handwriting shaky from pain, "God sees all. We are in his hands. Suffering brings us closer to the Savior." But God did not answer, and no Savior came. What did come was the complete inversion of Alexandra's world. She was no longer Her Majesty. The guards called her Mrs. Romanova, sometimes old woman, sometimes worse. Her daughters, once groomed to be future queens and duchesses, were mocked for their English manners and chastised for any trace of pride. One day, a guard slapped Grand Duchess Maria for speaking without permission. Another, it said, urinated in their food before serving it. For Alexandra, the psychological torment went beyond humiliation. It was the absolute destruction of maternal protection. She could no longer shield her children from the world's ugliness. She could no longer promise them safety. In fact, she may have begun to suspect she had delivered them into this fate herself, by her pride, her blindness, her unwavering support of a husband incapable of seeing the revolution for what it was. That doubt, that guilt, became a silent tormentor in those final weeks. And still, she clung to Rasputin's prophecies. Long after his murder, he had told her once, "You will suffer much, but the dynasty will endure if I am alive." But Rasputin was dead, stabbed, poisoned, drowned, and with him, the last thread of mystical reassurance. Now there were only signs, unmistakable ones. The guards stopped speaking. More men arrived, strange men in civilian clothes, who asked no questions and gave no instructions. Whispers passed between soldiers, words like order and soon and final. A new commandant took over, Yakov Yurovsky. He was calm, methodical, cold. Alexandra felt it. The end. She began suffering, fainting spells. Her legs swelled. Her face grew pale and thin like wax. Some guards said she looked already embalmed. Her daughters stood by her bedside for hours at a time, praying, singing hymns, holding her hand. She kept asking, "When will Nicky return?" They kept lying, "Soon, Mama, he's safe." But they all knew the truth. Nicholas was in the room just down the hall, and he was no safer than they were. The Romanovs had become a dead family walking, a relic, a curse on the future. The Bolsheviks needed them gone, not just physically, but symbolically. Lenin wanted no chance of royalists using the Romanovs as figureheads. The new Russia could not have ghosts, and so the final preparations began. Quietly, efficiently, and yet, to the Tsarina, it must have felt apocalyptic. It wasn't just death she sensed, it was erasure, an unraveling of meaning, a black hole where history used to be. She wrote one final entry in her diary on July 16th, 1918, weather. Grey. Alexei has improved. We played cards. Olga reads aloud. God have mercy on us. That night she would kiss her daughters for the last time. That night the guards would clean their rifles. That night Alexandra would comb her hair, place her jewels in the lining of her corset, perhaps thinking they'd be confiscated, not knowing it would make her execution longer, crueler, and far more horrific. The ritual of death was already underway. The death of Tsarina Alexandra was not the spontaneous end of a broken monarchy. It was an act of institutional erasure, methodical, deliberate, and cruel in its bureaucratic efficiency. She was not merely executed. She was dismantled piece by a system that had learned how to destroy not just bodies, but legacies. When Alexandra was imprisoned in the House of Special Purpose, it was no accident that her conditions deteriorated into psychological and physical degradation. The Bolsheviks were not merely detaining the Romanovs, they were testing the limits of dehumanization. The process was incremental, the cruelty insidious. They knew better than to make martyrs. What they wanted was something more final, to make her irrelevant. The Soviet regime, still embryonic and chaotic, was paranoid. At its heart was fear, not just of external invasion, but of the ghosts of aristocracy. The Romanovs were symbols, living emblems of everything Lenin and his revolutionaries had sworn to eradicate. But symbols have power even after death, unless they are desecrated, humiliated, made into cautionary tales. Alexandra, with her foreign birth, rigid orthodoxy, and mystical leanings, was the perfect vessel for this ritual punishment. The system did not come at her all at once. It came through quiet cruelty. Guards who confiscated religious icons but left her the empty frames. Doctors who visited rarely and offered no medicine. Promises of relocation that turned into threats. The food was steadily poisoned with indifference, undercooked. Gruel, old bread, dirty water. Illness was constant. Her legs swelled so much she could no longer walk unaided. The institutional gaslighting was total. For months, Alexandra was told she was being moved soon. That she would be reunited with Nicholas, then later with Alexei, who was kept isolated under the pretense of fragile health. She was told there was peace on the streets, that the world had forgotten them. Her letters were intercepted. Her news was censored. Her guards were forbidden from using the word execution. The Soviets didn't want the Romanovs to resist. They wanted them compliant, hopeful, broken. In this way, Alexandra's destruction was almost surgical. The stripping of her dignity began long before her death. From the moment of arrest, the rituals that defined her identity were methodically removed. Her title, her retinue, her wardrobe, her autonomy, even motherhood, her last remaining purpose, was weaponized against her. She could watch, but not intervene, as her daughters were abused by the guards. Innuendos were whispered, jokes made. One story, recounted by later witnesses, told of a drunken soldier propositioning Grand Duchess Tatiana, while Alexandra sat just feet away, powerless. Then there was the systematic dismantling of her selfhood through surveillance and mockery. The Empress, who had once received adoring applause in gilded European ballrooms, was now the subject of cruel mimicry. Guards imitated her limp. They mocked her accent. They read aloud her diary entries in exaggerated tones. This wasn't just psychological torment. It was performative degradation. The regime wasn't content to kill the Romanovs. They wanted to rewrite them in real time. In those final weeks, the walls of the house were scrubbed of portraits. The floors were covered in sawdust. Even the family dog was taken away. The children stopped laughing. Alexei cried more often, though no one came when he did, and Alexandra, always the proud empress, began to vanish. Not in body, but in presence. She spoke little. She sat often. Her posture slackened. She clutched her rosary like it was the last thread of herself she could hold on to. Outside the walls, Russia was transforming. The Bolsheviks were consolidating power, forging myths. Newspapers declared the Romanovs irrelevant. Pamphlets denounced them as parasites, German spies, bloodsuckers of the people. In Petrograd and Moscow, former nobles were rounded up and tried. In sham courts, aristocratic estates were burned, priests were hanged, names were changed. Alexandra, once the most powerful woman in Eastern Europe, was no longer even considered a prisoner of interest. She was a relic, a liability, but make no mistake, every moment of her suffering was engineered. When the order came down from Lenin's inner circle to eliminate the Romanovs, there was no trial, no public statement, no official reasoning. The command was, phrased clinically, bureaucratically, the Ural Soviet has decided to carry out the sentence. The execution was to be secret, swift, and total. No body to display, no grave to visit, no shrine to martyrdom, just a whisper in the night, and then silence. It was the final stage in Alexandra's destruction, not simply to kill her, but to ensure that when she died, she would be mourned by no one, remembered by few, and blamed by history. That night, she dressed carefully. She helped her daughters tie the ribboned bodices of their corsets. She placed the imperial jewels, rubies, emeralds, diamonds, inside her dress, as she'd done during their arrest. Whether she hoped to barter with them, or simply wanted to die as a Romanov, no one knows, but the guards knew. They let her wear them, because those jewels would make the bullets ricochet, would make the slaughter take longer, would make it messier, would make it crueler. Everything was already in place. The cellar was swept, the guns distributed, the excuses prepared. What followed next was not a death. It was a ritual erasure of a woman, a dynasty, and the illusion of divine right. It was just after midnight on July 17th, 1918. A knock, a voice, an order. The doctor recommends you move to the basement, for safety. The Tsar, the Tsarina, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, stirred from sleep. They dressed quietly in the dark. The daughters helped their mother down the stairs, her swollen legs dragging behind her. Nicholas carried Alexei, his hemophilia now so advanced he could barely walk. The family believed they were being evacuated, but the guards, tight-lipped, eyes averted, already knew. Below them, in the cellar, the space had been prepared with Surgical precision, a single room, bare brick walls, a chair for Alexei, a line drawn in invisible chalk where the executioners would stand. Rifles had been issued, bayonets were affixed, extra ammunition stocked. A camera was set up in the hallway, ready to capture the last remnants of the Romanov dynasty. Alexandra entered last, breathing heavily. It was stifling underground, and the air was thick with damp rot. She clutched her son's shoulder, her body draped in black silk. Her corset, unknowingly, was stuffed with nearly 4 pounds of diamonds sewn into the lining. The girls had done the same, not out of vanity, but because they had been taught to prepare for flight, for confiscation, for hunger. They were still thinking like prisoners, but the men in the room were no longer guards. They were executioners. The family stood together as Yurovsky entered. His voice was calm, mechanical. Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas turned. What? He asked, confused. He never had time to finish the word. The first bullet tore through his chest, then chaos. Multiple gunmen opened fire at once. But the room, small and echoing, quickly filled with smoke and screams. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, some off bone, others off the precious stones sewn into the daughters' corsets. One of the girls, perhaps Maria or Anastasia, screamed. As she staggered unharmed, the bullet deflected by a hidden jewel. Another collapsed but remained alive, choking, bleeding out slowly. The guns jammed. The guards panicked. Yurovsky shouted orders, but they were drowned by the wails of wounded. Girls crawling across the floor, pleading, clutching their dying parents. Some executioners, unable to shoot clearly through the thick gunpowder smoke, turned to bayonets. What followed was not execution. It was butchery. Alexandra was shot sitting down, her arms wrapped around Alexei. One witness claimed it took multiple bullets to finally kill her. The diamonds beneath her dress made her body jolt strangely, her blood pooling around gemstones that sparkled grotesquely under the lantern light. Olga and Tatiana tried to shield each other. Bayonet wounds were found in their torsos and faces. Their corsets acted like armor, delaying death but prolonging agony. The youngest daughters were stabbed when the bullets wouldn't pierce them. Alexei, still in his chair, was the last to die. They shot him in the head, point blank. His small body slumped without a sound, and then, for a moment, silence. 13 minutes. That's how long it took. 13 minutes to obliterate 300 years of monarchy. But the horror didn't end. There, the bodies were stripped naked. The dresses, heavy with blood and diamonds, were looted. One girl, historians believe it was Tatiana, was found with pieces of flesh missing from her ribcage, hacked away during the frenzy. The corpses were loaded onto a truck and driven into the woods. During transport, one of the girls was reportedly heard moaning. She was beaten again with the butt of a rifle. They tried to burn the bodies, then poured acid over them. When the flames failed to consume the bones, they chopped them into pieces and buried the remains in an unmarked pit outside Ekaterinburg. All of it, every second, had been designed not just to end the Romanovs, but to erase them from memory, to break the myth, to bury the dream of monarchy under charred flesh and shattered skulls. And for Alexandra, this was the final desecration, not the loss of her crown, nor her throne, nor even her life, but the manner in which it was taken. There was no dignity, no prayer, no silence, only panic, screams, and then dirt. The Empress of all the Russias, once revered as the divine consort of a sacred autocracy, now lay face down in a shallow grave, her lips stained with blood, her ribs shattered by bayonets, her face unrecognizable. Later, the Soviet leadership would refer to the event only obliquely. Lenin never admitted to ordering it. The executioners, most of them, were never punished. Some even received medals. For decades, the truth was buried, literally, and metaphorically, and yet fragments survived, eyewitness accounts, smuggled letters, stray bones unearthed by hikers decades later. The truth, Alexandra's truth, refused to stay buried. But the image of her last moments, locked in a windowless cellar, holding her dying child, watching her daughters butchered, beside her, is more than a historical footnote. It is a psychological black hole, a vortex of brutality, betrayal, and disbelief. A family, once divine, reduced to meat. When the doors to the basement finally closed on the Romanovs' screams, the Soviet Union opened a new chapter in its history, one soaked in blood and silence. But even as the Ural Soviet celebrated the cleansing of the former imperial family, the chaos they had unleashed spiraled far beyond the walls of that cellar. The immediate aftermath of Tsarina Alexandra's execution was not triumph. It was confusion. The official story, if one can call it that, was fractured from the start. The Bolsheviks released a vague statement claiming Nicholas had been executed, but omitted any mention of Alexandra or the children. The goal was not clarity, it was control. Disinformation became the first tool in erasing the Romanovs not just from power, but from collective memory. Alexandra, already vilified in life, now vanished without explanation in death. But silence breeds suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire across Europe that Alexandra had escaped, that her daughters had fled, that Alexei was being raised in secret. Each whisper revealed a deeper psychological truth, that people could not, would not believe the Romanovs had simply ceased to exist. And why would they? The idea of Alexandra dying in a nameless forest, stripped of dignity and dumped like garbage, felt impossible. Too grotesque, too final. Monarchies fall, empires crumble, but the death of a Tsarina, of a mother, an empress, a woman of divine status, was supposed to be ceremonial, public, reverent. Not this, not what actually happened. In England, King George V, Alexandra's cousin, received the news with cold formality, but beneath the veneer of state decorum lay deep personal guilt. Just months earlier, he had denied the Romanovs asylum. Political expediency had outweighed blood. The British monarchy, fearing the contagion of revolution, had turned its back. For Queen Mary, who had once admired Alexandra's beauty and stoicism, the news struck harder. Her letters became guarded, clipped. She refused to speak openly of her cousin's death for years. In Germany, where Alexandra's Hessian relatives mourned in private, grief was suffocated by war. Her brother, Grand Duke Ernest Louis, broke down upon learning the truth. "No man," he reportedly said, "has the right to kill a mother in front of her children." But in Russia, mourning was not permitted. Speaking the Romanovs' names could invite suspicion. Praying for them marked you as a monarchist sympathizer. Church bells did not toll for Alexandra. No candles burned in her name. The Russian Orthodox Church, under Bolshevik suppression, dared not risk a formal requiem. Instead, grief went underground. Among the peasantry, many of whom had once revered the Tsarina as a holy mother, legends blossomed. Alexandra became a martyr in whispered prayers, a ghost who walked among the birch trees where her body had been dumped. Icon painters, working in secret, began to include her face in depictions of royal saints, alongside Olga of Kiev and Catherine the Great. But the psychological wounds were deeper than folklore. For Alexandra's surviving relatives, the trauma was generational. Her surviving sister, Ella, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who had become a nun, was arrested just days before the Romanovs' execution. She, too, was murdered, beaten and thrown into a mineshaft, left to die with other Romanov relatives. Her final words, reportedly, were prayers for Alexandra and the children. The ripple effect continued across the former empire. Loyal servants, friends and aristocratic supporters were interrogated, exiled or executed. The Romanov name became toxic. Schoolbooks scrubbed their reign. Streets once named for the Tsarina were renamed for Bolshevik heroes, but the trauma was not limited to Russia's elite. Ordinary Russians, those who had grown up under Alexandra's image in portraits and coinage, now found themselves gaslit by the state. The Empress, who once represented divine femininity, was recast as a foreign parasite, a hysterical mystic, a traitor. Her memory became a battleground between fact and fiction. For those who had known her intimately, her ladies-in-waiting, her nurses, her guards, the silence was unbearable. Some fled to Paris, London, or Berlin. Many wrote memoirs. Some embellished. Others confessed their complicity in allowing Alexandra to be led like a lamb to slaughter, but none could fully articulate the horror of what they'd witnessed. And as the years passed, Alexandra's legacy calcified into myth. To monarchists, she became a suffering saint, a regal mother martyred for her faith and her bloodline. To revolutionaries, she remained a symbol of tyranny, a cautionary tale of arrogance and excess. But in reality, she was something far more tragic, a woman whose life was destroyed by forces she never truly understood, and whose death was designed not just to end her, but to obliterate the emotional power of her memory. The Bolsheviks did not fear Alexandra's political power. By the end, she had none. They feared her symbolic power. They feared the mother, the martyr, the relic of divine right, so they erased her. But history has a way of unearthing its buried horrors. Decades later, in the late 1970s, two amateur historians discovered bones in a shallow grave near Ekaterinburg. Forensic testing was incomplete. The Soviet government denied everything. The truth, Alexandra's bones, would remain hidden for another 20 years. It was only in 1991, with the Soviet Union crumbling, that her remains were confirmed. DNA analysis identified her skull. Her pelvis, her teeth, her long bones, shattered and scorched, matched witness accounts. Even in death she had been dismembered, made to disappear. But she was found. And in that act of recovery, a new reckoning began. Alexandra's story, once censored, sanitized, or twisted, could finally be told in full. But what remained was not just the narrative of an empress. It was the psychological echo of a woman's annihilation, of a family's destruction, of a myth carefully murdered. The official story of Tsarina Alexandra's death has been a carefully constructed mosaic of omissions, half-truths, and outright lies. For decades, the Soviet regime controlled the narrative with an iron grip, reshaping the memory of the Romanovs to serve the needs of the emerging totalitarian state. This was not merely about political expediency. It was about annihilating the very essence of who Alexandra was, her identity, her humanity, and the emotional resonance of her life and death. In the aftermath of the execution, Soviet authorities undertook a systematic campaign to erase every trace of Alexandra from public consciousness. Statues were toppled, portraits defaced, and royal palaces repurposed as museums celebrating proletarian victory. School curricula transformed her from an empress into a villainess, an emblem of decadent foreign oppression. The Romanovs were reframed as parasitic enemies of the people, rather than tragic victims of political upheaval. Yet, the official narrative also omitted the most brutal details of her final moments. The stories of the botched execution, the bayonet, wounds, the diamonds that saved the daughters from immediate death, these grisly facts were suppressed or denied outright. To the Soviet public, Alexandra's death was a clean, necessary act of justice, swift, inevitable, and devoid of drama. This sanitized myth-making had a dual purpose. It justified the revolution and cemented Lenin's legitimacy, while also denying the Romanovs martyrdom that might inspire future monarchists or religious devotees. The Soviet regime knew that public sympathy is a powerful force. By controlling the story, they controlled the legacy. But behind the veil of state propaganda, whispers persisted. White émigrés, scattered across Europe, kept alive an alternate history, one rich with personal anecdotes, secret letters, and haunting memories. These narratives portrayed Alexandra as a devoted mother trapped by political chaos, a woman tormented by isolation and betrayal, whose tragic death was the ultimate sacrifice of a doomed dynasty. Among the Russian Orthodox faithful, clandestine commemorations honored her as a saint and martyr. In defiance of official repression, they maintained relics, icons, and oral histories that preserved the truth of her suffering and sanctity. For these believers, Alexandra's erasure was a wound that could never fully heal. The late 20th century marked a turning point. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a floodgate of archival material was opened. Secret documents, photographs, and forensic reports began to surface, revealing the horrific reality of the Romanovs' final hours. These discoveries shattered the sanitized myths, exposing a truth far darker than the public had ever been told. Scholars and historians pieced together the grisly puzzle of Alexandra's last moments. Her slow decline in captivity, the grotesque details of the execution, and the deliberate effort to conceal the bodies and suppress mourning. The brutal facts were undeniable, but they also clashed with the official narrative that had dominated for decades. Even with the unearthing of physical remains and archival evidence, Alexandra's legacy remained contested territory. Nationalist factions sought to rehabilitate her image, emphasizing her faith and familial devotion. Some politicians invoked her tragic story as a symbol of Russia's lost greatness and the cruelty of revolutionary violence. Meanwhile, others warned against romanticizing a figure associated with autocracy, privilege, and political misjudgment. This tension highlighted a broader psychological phenomenon: the struggle over memory itself. Who controls history controls identity. By rewriting Alexandra's story, different factions shaped how Russians understood their past and imagined their future. Was she a saint or a sinner? A victim or a villain? A mother or a monarch? The answers depended largely on who wielded the pen. Moreover, Alexandra's erasure and manipulation extended beyond historical texts into popular culture. Soviet-era films avoided depicting her directly or cast her as a peripheral figure. In contrast, post-Soviet media often sensationalized her mysticism and tragic romance with Rasputin, distorting complex realities into melodrama. The public imagination became a battleground where Alexandra was alternately demonized, romanticized, or reduced to a tragic footnote. This fragmentation of her legacy revealed the psychological scars of a society still grappling with the trauma of revolution, violence, and loss. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this erasure was its personal dimension. Alexandra's descendants and relatives, many living in exile, endured decades of stigma and marginalization. Their attempts to memorialize her and the Romanovs were met with suspicion or indifference. Letters and memoirs were ignored or dismissed. The pain of familial loss was compounded by the erasure of identity. In a cruel paradox, the woman who had been one of the most visible figures of her time became, after death, a ghost whose story was forbidden, distorted, or forgotten. Yet, the truth has a stubborn persistence. In recent decades, new scholarship, documentaries, and public commemorations have begun to restore some measure of justice to Alexandra's memory. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized her and her family as passion bearers, holy figures who endured suffering with grace and faith. Still, the layers of manipulation and myth-making remain visible beneath the surface, a reminder that history is never neutral but always contested, In the shadows of Alexandra's erased legacy lies a haunting question. What does it mean to be forgotten? And who decides? The story of Tsarina Alexandra's death is not merely a chapter in the annals of history. It is a mirror reflecting timeless struggles of power, gender, and the fragility of identity under siege. As we gaze back through the fog of revolution and bloodshed, we find in her fate a psychological parable, a cautionary tale about how societies wield trauma as a weapon, how narratives are crafted to serve the powerful, and how the most vulnerable are erased in the process. Alexandra was a woman born into privilege, but trapped by it. Her status as empress, once a crown of glory, became a gilded cage, constraining her choices, amplifying her fears, and exposing her to relentless political violence. Yet she was also a mother, a believer, and a human being whose inner world was marked by grief, hope, and an agonizing sense of loss. Her psychological downfall, intertwined with the catastrophic collapse of the Romanov dynasty, was driven not only by external forces, revolutionaries, assassins, and conspirators, but also by the isolating weight of her own position. Cut off from empathy, surrounded by suspicion, and manipulated by Rasputin's shadow, she was a prisoner of her own illusions and the merciless currents of history. In this, her story resonates disturbingly with modern dynamics of power and gender. Women in positions of authority, whether queens, politicians, CEOs, or public figures, continue to face a unique form of psychological warfare. They are subject to relentless scrutiny, vilification, and sometimes brutal erasure. Their legacies twisted to fit narratives that diminish or demonize them. The erasure of Alexandra's legacy parallels contemporary battles over truth and memory. In an age saturated by media manipulation and cancel culture, just as Bolshevik propaganda reshaped her story to serve revolutionary aims, today's information landscape can distort, silence, or weaponize personal histories. The struggle to reclaim one's narrative remains a deeply psychological ordeal, fraught with trauma and resilience. Moreover, Alexandra's tragic end underscores the human cost of political violence. Her death, marked by terror, betrayal, and degradation, reminds us that the victims of upheaval are not abstractions or statistics, but real people with fears, dreams, and wounds. The spectacle of power tearing itself apart often leaves behind shattered lives, broken families, and legacies stained by pain. Her final moments, alone in a cellar, clutching her son, surrounded by the blood of her daughters, evoke a haunting image of a mother undone by forces beyond her control. It is a scene that transcends time and place, inviting empathy and reflection on how power can crush the most intimate human bonds. In the end, Tsarina Alexandra's death was more than a political event. It was a psychological catastrophe, a violent collision of identity, faith, and history. The scars it left ripple through the centuries, touching on themes of gendered violence, memory manipulation, and the fragile boundary between myth and reality. As we confront these echoes today, we are challenged to recognize the patterns of erasure and control that persist in our own time. To remember that behind every historical figure lies a human soul, vulnerable and complex, and to honor the truths hidden beneath layers of propaganda, silence, and myth. Alexandra's story is a testament to the enduring power of memory and the haunting cost of forgetting. Her death was not just an end. It was a shadow cast across history, a dark reminder of what happens when humanity is sacrificed at the altar of power, and that shadow still lingers.